It was a cold October morning when I drove up the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees were a mixture of fading green and burnt orange, the last vestiges of autumn before winter came in full force. The sun was just peeking over the hills, and the air had that sharp crispness that made every breath feel like it cleaned your lungs. I had been planning this trip for months. A week away from the noise of the city, from the endless emails, from people and responsibilities. I wanted silence, solitude, and a break from everything. The cabin was my uncle's, a small wooden structure tucked away deep in the Vermont woods. It hadn't been used in years, but he had recently passed away, and I'd inherited it. I wasn't in a rush to sell or rent it. Part of me wanted to spend some time there, maybe even fix it up. The cabin was remote, with no phone service and no electricity except for a solar panel that barely worked. It was perfect for the kind of escape I needed. I parked my old Jeep on the gravel driveway. The wheels crunched loudly against the loose stones. The place looked exactly like I remembered from the few times I had visited as a kid. Weathered with siding, a stone chimney, a small porch with a rocking chair that swayed gently in the breeze. The windows were dusty, the glass a bit foggy with age, but the place had a solid feel. It wasn't fancy, but it was homey. I grabbed my backpack from the car, along with a few bags of groceries, a stack of firewood, and a case of bottled water. I wasn't exactly roughing it, but I was definitely not bringing any modern comforts beyond the basics. The cabin had a small propane stove, an old refrigerator that probably wouldn't work well, and a single bed in the loft upstairs. The moment I stepped inside, the smell hit me. A mix of pine, dust, and old wood. The floorboards creaked under my boots as I walked to the kitchen area. There was a small wooden table, a few chairs, and a rusted sink with a manual pump to bring water from a well. The place was cold. The heating system was a small wood stove that sat in the corner of the living room. I set my bags down and pulled off my jacket. I opened the windows a crack, letting fresh air in, even if it was chilly. Then I set to work. I stacked the firewood carefully, grabbed some kindling, and lit a fire in the stove. The crackling flames brought warmth and a soft glow to the room. It felt good to be alone, surrounded by silence except for the pop and hiss of the fire. After unpacking, I went outside to explore a bit. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing, with thick woods on three sides. The trees were tall and old, mostly pines mixed with maples and oaks. The ground was carpeted with fallen leaves and pine needles, muffling footsteps. I walked a little way down a faint trail that disappeared into the forest. I could hear birds somewhere, maybe a squirrel chattering. There was no one around for miles. I liked that feeling, no roads, no traffic, no other houses nearby, just me and the woods. Back inside, I cooked a simple meal on the stove, canned soup heated slowly in a pot, a sandwich. I ate at the table by the window and watched the sun sink behind the hills. The sky turned a deep blue, and the first stars appeared. I decided to stay up a little while longer to enjoy the fire. The night came quickly in the woods. Darkness surrounded the cabin like a thick blanket. I could hear the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of animals moving in the brush. Owls hooted somewhere far off. The sound was comforting at first, but as the night deepened, it started to feel a little different, less peaceful, more watchful. I was alone, really alone, farther from help than I had been in years. I went to bed early that night, pulling the old wool blanket over me. The loft was cold, but I had a flashlight by the bed. I wasn't worried, just tired. The next few days were quiet and routine. I woke with the sun, built a fire, cooked meals, and spent most of my time reading or walking short distances around the cabin. I brought a few books, but I found myself more interested in the woods themselves. The trees, the wildlife, the way the light shifted through the branches. I felt like I was living in another time. But on the third night, something changed. It started subtly. I was sitting by the fire, the cabin lit only by the flames and a dim lamp. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window panes. The forest seemed louder somehow, the cracking of branches, the scurrying of small animals. Then I noticed the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. I froze. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking carefully, trying not to make too much noise, but the dry leaves and gravel betrayed them. My heart rate quickened. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the window, trying to see into the darkness. Nothing, just the shadows of the trees and the dark outline of the porch. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the sound was too heavy, too purposeful. I sat back down, telling myself I must be imagining things. I kept the fire burning bright and locked the door, though the cabin had a simple latch that wouldn't stop much if someone really wanted to get in. The footsteps continued off and on for the next hour, always close, always just outside the cabin. I didn't dare go outside. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. They were fresh, but not from any animal I recognized. The prints were too large to be from a deer or raccoon, human. Someone had been there during the night. I tried to think who it might be. Maybe a hunter or a local looking for game. But the road was so far away, and it was late in the season. No hunting was allowed on this property. Still, I wasn't entirely sure. The footprints circled around the cabin like whoever it was pacing. I felt uneasy for the first time. The woods didn't feel welcoming anymore. I spent the day checking all the locks, securing windows with furniture where I could. I even fashioned a makeshift spear from a sturdy branch. That night was worse. I heard voices outside, whispering, low and hard to understand. I stayed completely still, listening. The voices didn't come close but drifted around the edge of the clearing. Then the footsteps came again, this time faster, like running. The back door rattled sharply. I grabbed the spear and stood near the door, ready to defend myself. But nothing came through the door. The sounds vanished into the darkness. Sleep didn't come. Over the next 2 days, the pattern repeated. Footsteps around the cabin at night, whispered voices in the distance, sometimes faint lights flickering between the trees. I never saw anyone clearly, but it was obvious I was being watched. I thought about leaving, driving back to the city and never returning. But something kept me rooted there, stubbornness, maybe, or a need to prove I wasn't afraid. On the 5th night, the noises came much earlier. I was outside chopping firewood when I heard a twig snap behind me. I turned quickly, nothing, but the feeling of eyes on me was undeniable. I gathered my tools and hurried back inside. The 6th day was the worst. In the afternoon, I noticed my Jeep door was open. I was sure I had locked it. I checked inside, nothing stolen, but my backpack was moved from the back seat to the front. Someone had been there. Panic hit me hard. I called the local sheriff's office from a payphone in town. The nearest place with phone service was 10 miles away. They told me they would send someone by in a day or two, but the roads were rough and the weather was turning. That night, the footsteps were louder, closer. I kept the fire roaring and sat near the door with my spear. Couldn't sleep. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. On the 7th day, I packed my things slowly. I wasn't going to stay another night. I felt the tension in my chest like a weight, the fear that someone was out there, watching, waiting for the right moment. Before I left, I went to check the perimeter one last time. The forest was quiet, too quiet.
No birds, no rustling.
My footsteps sounded loud and empty on the leaf-strewn path. Then, about 50 yards from the cabin, I saw it. A small campsite hidden in the trees. Someone had been living there with a makeshift lean-to and a fire pit still warm. There were footprints all around, leading toward the cabin. I understood then that the noises, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched had all been from someone living in the woods nearby, unseen but always there. The woods weren't haunted by ghosts or legends. They were haunted by a person, a real human being. Someone who didn't want me there, who had been watching me the whole time. I left that morning without looking back. Driving down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. The cabin remained behind me, quiet and empty once more. But I knew it was no longer safe, at least not for me. When I got home, I sold the Jeep and found a small apartment in the city. I never told anyone the full story. It felt too real, too scary to admit out loud. The cabin in the pines was supposed to be a refuge, a place of peace and solitude. Instead, it was a place that reminded me how vulnerable we are when we're truly alone. Sometimes, when the wind howls at night, I think about the footsteps in the dirt and the hidden campsite, and I wonder who was watching me and what might have happened if I had stayed one night longer. It was the fall of 1998 when I decided to take a week off from my job and head out to the mountains of northern Idaho. I was 34 years old then, living a quiet life in Boise, working as a mechanic during the week, and chasing hunting seasons whenever I could. Hunting was something I grew up with. My father and grandfather had taken me since I was a kid. I loved the stillness of the woods, the sharp, clean air, the way the sun filtered through the trees in golden beams, and the sounds of nature that made city noise seem like a distant nightmare. That year, I had been saving up for a week alone in the wilderness. No distractions, no phones, no people. I packed up my gear carefully. My rifle, some extra ammunition, a heavy-duty hunting knife, a small first aid kit, a couple of flashlights, and enough food and water to last me the week. I also brought along a well-worn map of the area, a compass, and a detailed guidebook about the wildlife and the best trails. The cabin I rented was out near Priest Lake, tucked deep in the forest, almost unreachable by any paved road. The last few miles had to be driven on a narrow dirt track barely wide enough for one car. The cabin was old but sturdy, made from thick logs that had weathered many winters. It sat at the edge of a clearing surrounded by tall pine and fir trees that reached to the sky. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth filled the air as I pulled up beside it. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A wood stove sat in one corner, cracked leather chairs lined the walls, and an old table with a few chairs stood near the small kitchen area. There was a bed with a thick wool blanket, and shelves full of dusty books and hunting trophies from the previous owner. The windows were small but let in just enough light to see by during the day. The first day was quiet, peaceful. I spent the morning unpacking and organizing my gear, then wandered the trails near the cabin. The forest was alive with the sound of rustling leaves and birdsong. I spotted deer tracks and even saw a few squirrels darting among the branches. It was exactly the kind of calm and solitude I had hoped for. I made a small fire outside, cooking some canned beans and warming up a strong cup of coffee. As the sun dipped behind the hills, the woods darkened quickly. I sat outside the cabin for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one. The cold began to settle in, so I went inside, stoked the fire, and settled down for an early night. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Early mornings spent scouting trails, moving slowly through the forest with my rifle slung over my shoulder, eyes sharp for movement. The crisp, cold air bit at my cheeks, but I enjoyed the feeling of being so far from the noise of the city. I didn't see much game, but I found good signs. Fresh tracks, scrapes on tree trunks, and droppings that told me animals were nearby. On the third day, I decided to hike farther out, beyond the main trails I'd explored. The map showed a small creek about 3 miles to the northeast of the cabin. I figured the water source would attract deer and maybe even elk, so I packed a light lunch, some water, and set off just after dawn. The trek was harder than I expected. The ground was uneven, covered with thick layers of fallen leaves and broken branches. The trees grew closer together, and patches of moss covered the rocks. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became, like the animals were watching me and holding their breath. After a few hours, I reached the creek. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones and creating small pools in the deeper spots. I paused to refill my canteen and take a break, sitting on a flat rock with my feet in the water. It was peaceful here. The only sounds were the gentle rush of the creek and the distant calls of birds. I spent the afternoon walking along the creek banks, looking for signs of deer or elk. I found fresh tracks, hoof prints pressed deeply into the mud. I settled down behind a thick bush, careful to stay hidden, and waited quietly, rifle ready. The light was fading when I spotted a young buck moving slowly through the trees, grazing on some fallen leaves. My heart beat faster as I raised the rifle, aimed carefully, but before I could shoot, a sharp crack echoed through the forest. I froze, the shot ringing in my ears. The buck bolted into the trees and disappeared. I looked around, trying to locate the source of the sound. There was no way anyone else should be this far out, but the shot was unmistakably close. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The forest was unnervingly quiet now, as if all the animals had vanished. I packed up quickly, keeping my rifle ready, and began the hike back to the cabin, constantly scanning the shadows between the trees. When I finally reached the clearing, the cabin looked dark and still. No smoke from the chimney, no movement. I unlocked the door, careful, and stepped inside. Everything seemed untouched, but the silence inside was heavy. That night, I kept the fire burning and the rifle close. Every sound outside made me jump. A branch snapping, the wind rustling the leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. I told myself it was just the forest doing what it always did, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found something strange near the cabin. In the dirt path leading up to the front door, there were fresh footprints, large, heavy, and uneven, like someone had been dragging their feet. They led from the edge of the forest to the cabin and stopped right at the threshold. The prints weren't human, or at least not any kind I recognized. My heart sank. I didn't know what to make of it. I checked the perimeter of the cabin and found more tracks circling around the back, going toward the woods again. They were huge, and the impression was deep in the mud. I felt a chill run down my spine. I spent the day inspecting the cabin, checking the locks and windows, making sure everything was secure. I decided I would pack up and leave first thing the next morning. Something about the place didn't feel right anymore. That afternoon, I tried to shake the unease by going out for a short walk, staying close to the cabin this time. I carried my rifle and kept my eyes open. The woods were quiet, maybe too quiet. There was no birdsong, no rustling, just the wind moving through the branches. Suddenly, I heard a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from the trees nearby. It wasn't a coyote or a wolf. It was something heavier, slower, more deliberate. My heart pounded as I scanned the forest, but I saw nothing. The growl came again, closer this time. I moved back toward the cabin as fast as I could without running. The growling followed, fading and then rising again, like something stalking me just out of sight. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of the cabin, slammed the door, and bolted it shut. That night was the worst. The growling continued around the cabin, shifting from one side to the other. At times, I heard heavy footsteps pounding through the brush, then silence. The fire was dying low, and I was too afraid to go outside to add wood. I sat awake all night, rifle ready, listening to the sounds outside. Every snap and rustle made me jump. I wondered if whatever was out there was a wild animal or something else. The tracks, the dragging marks, the strange footprints, none of it added up. In the early hours, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The forest grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that pressed against your ears and made your skin crawl. I waited until the first light of morning before stepping outside. The forest looked normal. No signs of struggle, no broken branches or disturbed bushes. I followed the strange footprints once more, tracing their path away from the cabin. They led deeper into the forest, toward the steep rocky hills. I spent the day packing my gear, checking everything twice. I kept my rifle close and my eyes peeled. I didn't want to stay here 1 minute longer than I had to. Late that afternoon, I began the drive back down the rough dirt road. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. I didn't stop once, focused entirely on getting away. When I reached the main highway and the cell signal came back, I called a friend to pick me up. I couldn't drive the last few miles home alone after what I'd experienced. In the safety of the city, I thought about what happened. The strange footprints, the growls, the dragging marks. I still don't know what they were. Maybe a large bear, or some unknown animal living deep in the Idaho wilderness. Maybe a hunter like me, someone trespassing on my spot. Whatever it was real, dangerous, and close enough to scare me out of the woods for good. I never went back to that cabin or that part of the forest. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear that growling, feel the cold eyes watching me from the trees. But I know one thing for sure, nature is wild, unpredictable, and sometimes, when you think you're alone, you really aren't. My name's Thomas. I'm 32 now, and this happened back in 2019. I haven't talked about it with many people. It wasn't supernatural or anything like that. No ghosts, no monsters, no weird lights in the sky. Just something real, something human, and something I still think about when I can't sleep. I grew up in Oregon but moved to Montana in my late 20s for work. I was a wildlife surveyor for a private research group that was contracted to monitor populations of elk and wolves near the Canadian border. The work was mostly solo, with the occasional partner rotation, and it required being out in the wilderness for days at a time. Suited me fine. I liked the quiet. I liked moving through the woods with just my gear and a map. This job came in mid-September. My assignment was to survey a corridor north of Eureka, just a few miles from the border, up near Lake Koocanusa. The place was dense forest, rough country, very few trails. Most of it was ATV access only. I was supposed to spend 4 days out there, tracking, photographing, and logging animal movement signs for a report due at the end of the month. I packed heavy like I always did. A good tent, sleeping bag, food for a week, water, filter pump, maps, a compass, a satellite phone, and a GPS tracker that updated my position for the office back in Missoula. I brought a sidearm, too. Not for people, really. More for bears or cougars, though I'd never had to use it. I started the hike mid-morning, parked the truck near a gate that marked the limit of where vehicles could go, and hoofed it the rest of the way with my gear. The area was beautiful, no doubt. Tall pines, the smell of fall just starting in the air, crisp wind brushing through the branches. I set up camp near a small clearing by a dry creek bed, maybe 7 miles from the truck. The first night was normal. I logged a couple sets of elk tracks, some scat, heard some coyotes off in the distance, ate a couple granola bars and some jerky, then turned in. I remember lying in my tent that night, listening to the wind pick up. It had a way of moving through the trees that made you feel like the woods were breathing around you. It was peaceful. The second day, I moved north, tracking deeper into the forest. I had planned to loop back toward the ridge by the 4th day, but I wanted to cover more ground this time. Around noon, I spotted a structure off to the west, something that hadn't been marked on any of the old Forest Service maps. It was a cabin, old, abandoned by the looks of it, set back about 30 yards from a game trail, half covered by overgrowth. One of the walls was bowed inward, and the roof was sagging under decades of rot and snow damage. Windows were boarded, but the boards were splitting. The wood was gray and cracked from age. I didn't think much of it at first. You find weird old buildings sometimes when you're out that far. People build things, then forget them or die or move on. But there was something strange about how isolated it was. No signs of a driveway, no trail leading up to it. It was like it had just been dropped there and left. I took a few pictures for my own curiosity and made a note on my map, then moved on. That night, I camped maybe 2 miles northeast of the cabin, near a granite outcrop. It was a rough, uneven spot, but dry. I built a small fire ring with stones, boiled some water, and ate. I tried reading for a while, but I kept thinking about that cabin. It stuck in my mind more than it should have. Not because it was creepy, but because of how wrong it felt. Like it didn't belong out there. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound. A thump. Not an animal. Not wind. It was heavy and low, like someone had dropped something solid not far from the tent. I stayed still, listening. My hand went to the grip of the pistol in my sleeping bag. Nothing else came, just the wind again. I eventually fell back asleep. The third day, I circled back south, keeping to high ground to get better visibility. I was supposed to head back to the truck the next morning, but I wanted to get one last set of trail cams placed before wrapping up. I kept thinking about the cabin, though. Part of me wanted to check it again. I didn't know why. Maybe I wanted to satisfy a weird itch in my brain. So I went back. It looked the same as before, though the light was different. The shadows were deeper. It had a darker feel to it, like the trees were leaning in more. I walked around the front, stepped onto what used to be a porch. The boards groaned under my boots. I pushed the door gently. It opened with a loud, dry creak. Inside, it was dim. Dust floated in the beams of light coming through cracks in the roof and walls. The floor was mostly intact, though warped. An old table, broken chairs, a small stove covered in rust. There were old clothes, too. Blankets, canteen. A pair of boots by the wall, cracked leather and falling apart. I noticed the smell then. Not rot, not mold, just something off. Like rust, maybe, or old blood. I can't explain it exactly, but it made my skin tighten. I backed out. I told myself it was just an old building, but I didn't want to be near it anymore. As I stepped off the porch, I noticed something in the dirt. Tracks. Not animal. Boots. Fresh. Too fresh. I crouched and looked closer. The pattern was clear. Deep treads. No more than a day old. They led around the back of the cabin. I didn't follow them. Instead, I slowly backed away, eyes scanning the treeline. Nothing moved, but my pulse was up. I walked fast, then faster, putting distance between me and that place. I didn't stop until I was nearly a mile away. I set camp in a thick patch of forest with good cover and limited visibility from the outside. I kept my pistol loaded that night. I didn't sleep much. Every time a twig snapped, I held my breath. Nothing came, but the woods felt different now. Tense, like something was watching. The fourth morning, I packed fast and headed straight for the truck.
No divergence.
No more tracking. I just wanted out. I didn't care about the report anymore. I just wanted to be back behind a locked door. I reached the truck by early afternoon. Everything looked normal, but when I opened the driver's door, I found something sitting on the front seat. It was a boot, not mine. Old, cracked leather, the same as the ones in the cabin. I froze. My keys were still in my front pants pocket, and the truck had been locked. No broken windows, no damage, just the boot. I scanned the treeline again, heart thudding in my throat. I unlocked the glove box and grabbed the spare pistol I kept there. I checked the back seat, the bed. Nothing. I got in and drove. Fast. I didn't stop until I hit paved road 30 miles later. I didn't call the police. What would I say? That someone left an old boot in my truck? That I found footprints by a cabin? I filed my report with the research group and told them I wouldn't be going back to that sector. They didn't ask why. A few weeks later, they reassigned the whole area to a different team. Since then, I've tried to forget it. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the sound I heard outside my tent, the tracks behind the cabin, the boot in the truck. I think about who might have been living out there, watching, and I think about how easy it would have been for them to follow me, to wait, to do something worse. But they didn't. That part haunts me the most. They let me go. They wanted me to find the boot, and they wanted me to know they were close. I never went back to that job. I moved back to Oregon 6 months later, got into forestry work for the county. I still go into the woods sometimes, but never alone, never that far, and never without thinking about that damn cabin near the border where someone still lives or hides, because that place wasn't abandoned. Not really. I never thought I'd go back to that cabin. Not after everything that happened with Emily, my ex-wife. But there I was, driving through the rough country roads of northern Vermont in the early autumn of 2015, a few years after our divorce. I was 38 then, freshly divorced for 2 years, trying to make sense of life again. The cabin was in a place called Hollow Creek, tucked away deep in the woods near a small town named Stowe. It was a place Emily and I had visited once when we were married, before things started to fall apart. The memories were heavy, but I told myself I needed a break from the city, from work, and from everything. The drive alone was long and tiring. I left late morning, and the sky was cloudy, heavy with the promise of rain. The roads were narrow, lined with tall pines amaples showing their first colors of fall, reds, oranges, and yellows. I passed a few scattered houses and farm fields, but mostly it was wilderness, quiet and untouched. The GPS lost signal miles before the cabin, and I had to rely on an old paper map I found in the glove box. The last few miles were gravel, winding sharply between hills and thick trees. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, my stomach dropped. The place looked even lonelier than I remembered. It was a small, 2-story wooden cabin, its paint faded and peeling. The windows were dusty, the porch sagged slightly, and some of the boards creaked under the wind. I grabbed my bags from the trunk and stepped out. The air was cool, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles filled my lungs. There was a narrow path behind the cabin that led down to a creek, where I used to fish with Emily on better days. Inside, the cabin was musty and smelled like old wood and dampness. Dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs hung from the corners. I flicked on the lights, but the power was out. The storm had knocked down some lines, I guessed. I dug around in the corner for some matches and candles I remembered Emily and I had left behind. I lit a few, setting them on the old wooden table, and unpacked my things slowly. The bed was still there, a bit rough but comfortable enough. There was a small wood stove in the corner, and I found some firewood stacked outside. The first night passed slowly. The rain started just after sunset, drumming against the roof and windows. I could hear the creek flowing nearby, its steady rush mixed with the occasional call of a distant owl. The cabin felt cold, not just from the weather but from the silence. I had no phone signal and no internet. For the first time in a long time, I was truly alone. On the second day, I decided to explore the surrounding woods. I wore an old jacket and boots, packed a small backpack with water, a map, some snacks, and a flashlight. The forest was thick, alive with the colors of fall and the smell of wet leaves and moss. The trail was barely visible, covered in fallen branches and leaves. I followed the creek downstream, where the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. As I walked, I noticed the trees grew older and more twisted. Moss hung from the branches like curtains, and the forest floor was soft and damp. I found some animal tracks, maybe deer or fox, and the occasional broken twig where something had passed recently. There was no sign of other people, no sounds of distant cars or voices, just the forest, vast and quiet. Around midday, I reached a small clearing with a fallen log and some wild berries growing nearby. I sat down to rest and ate a few berries, though I wasn't sure if they were safe. The sky was getting darker with thick clouds, and the wind had picked up. I decided to head back, but the forest seemed different. The trees cast longer shadows, and the trail was harder to follow. I kept my flashlight out just in case, even though it was still daylight. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting a deep orange glow over the treetops. I started a fire in the wood stove to warm up and dry my clothes. The cabin felt a little less lonely with the flames dancing and crackling. I cooked some canned beans and bread for dinner, eating quietly in the flickering candlelight. That night, the wind was stronger, rattling the windows and making the roof creak. I heard something outside. Maybe an animal, maybe just the wind. It was hard to tell. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind drifting back to Emily and the fights we had, the silence between us, the empty bed I was sharing now with nothing but memories. The next morning, I woke early to a thick fog hanging low over the trees. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and cold. I checked the firewood, still enough to keep the stove going for another day. I made coffee over the stove and sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the mist swirl around the trees. As the day went on, I tried to distract myself with small chores. I fixed a loose board on the porch, cleaned some of the dust inside, and chopped more firewood. But something about the cabin felt off. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Late that afternoon, I went to the creek to refill my water bottle. The path was slippery from the rain, and the ground was soft. I knelt down by the water and looked up and down the creek. The silence was thick. I thought I saw something move just beyond the trees. A figure maybe, but when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a deer or a hunter passing by. I decided not to go far that evening. I stayed close to the cabin and kept the fire burning strong. But as the sun set and the shadows grew long, the feeling of unease grew with it. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves rustling. But every time I looked out, there was nothing there. Then, around midnight, the noises grew louder. Footsteps crunching on the gravel outside. Heavy breathing. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully opened the door, scanning the darkness. Nothing but the dense forest. The wind had stopped completely. The world felt unnervingly still. I locked the door and bolted it, but the footsteps continued, circling the cabin. I sat back against the door, my heart pounding. I thought about calling the police, but I had no signal. I considered packing up and leaving, but the storm was supposed to come back tomorrow, and the roads could be worse. I stayed up the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, waiting for the dawn. When morning came, the forest was silent again, and the cabin felt cold and empty. I opened the door carefully. Outside, there were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I checked around the cabin, nothing. That day, I packed most of my things. I didn't want to stay another night. The memories of Emily, the loneliness, and now the fear felt like a weight I couldn't carry. Before I left, I walked down to the creek one last time. The water ran clear, the forest was peaceful, and the sunlight broke through the mist. I realized that the cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or spirits, but by the ghosts of my own past, loneliness, regret, and the things I couldn't fix. Driving away from Hollow Creek, the trees closed behind me, and the road took me back to the world I knew. I didn't look back. I never went back to that cabin again. It was October of 2019 when I decided to head up to northern Idaho to build a small cabin for myself. I was 32, single, working a remote IT job that let me take long leaves if I needed to. After living in the city for years, I had gotten tired of everything. The traffic, the noise, the concrete. I wanted something different, something slower, quieter, more grounded. So I bought 5 acres of forested land about an hour and a half from Sandpoint, not far from the Canadian border. The property was remote. No cell service, no neighbors nearby. Just pine trees, brush, and a small creek running along the back of the land. It felt peaceful when I first walked it, like a place no one else had touched in years. My plan was simple. Spend a few weeks up there building a small off-grid cabin. Nothing fancy, just a dry structure with a wood stove, a bed, and enough shelter to get me through the winter if I wanted to stay longer. I brought my old truck, a trailer filled with tools, a generator, propane tanks, and a bunch of supplies. I had pre-cut some lumber and loaded it on the trailer too, enough to at least frame the shell of the place. The first couple of days went smoothly. I cleared a small section with a chainsaw, leveled the ground by hand using a shovel and some gravel, and laid out concrete pier blocks to support the floor frame. I had to haul water from the creek in big blue barrels just to mix concrete for some of the anchors. It was hard work, and by the end of each day I was beat. I slept in a tent under a rain tarp about 30 feet from the build site. I kept a cooler nearby and cooked simple meals on a camp stove. Every night I fell asleep with the sound of owls and the occasional crack of tree limbs falling somewhere out in the dark woods. By the 4th day, clouds started to gather. The air felt heavier, and you could smell the shift in the weather. I was ahead of schedule, so I pushed hard to get the floor finished before the rain came. I was working until dusk, hammering in the joists and laying the subfloor in sections. I wore gloves, but my hands were still blistered and sore. That evening, after I finished for the day, I made some ramen and sat under the tarp. That's when the wind picked up, sharp gusts whipping through the trees. It was followed by a light drizzle, then a steady rain. I didn't think much of it. It was October in northern Idaho. Rain was normal, but it didn't stop. It kept falling through the night, tapping hard against the rain fly above my tent. By morning, everything was soaked. The tarp had sagged in the middle, and the tent's floor had puddles in it. I wore my rain gear, but it was still miserable. The ground had turned soft, muddy. I spent the morning under the tarp, fixing my tools, trying to keep things dry. The rain didn't let up. Around mid-afternoon, I decided to keep building. I couldn't afford to wait forever, and I was stubborn. I framed the first 2 walls in the rain, slipping on the wet boards, wiping water off everything I touched. The plywood was swelling a bit, but it was usable. I'd nail something, then cover it with a plastic sheet and weigh it down with whatever I could find. Rocks, extra lumber, even my cooler. I worked like that for hours, my boots caked with mud, water dripping down the back of my neck. As it got darker, I packed things up and headed back to the tent. Everything was damp. My sleeping bag was cold. I barely slept. I just laid there, listening to the steady sound of rain and the trees swaying. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard something that wasn't the rain. It was a deep cracking sound, like wood splitting, followed by a loud crash. It echoed across the forest. A tree had fallen. That much I knew. I didn't know how far or what it hit, but I stayed in the tent, unmoving. The idea of going out there in the middle of the night, soaked and alone, didn't sit right with me. By sunrise, the rain had slowed to a mist. I crawled out and walked toward the cabin site. I could see it right away. A large pine, easily 30 feet tall, had collapsed just 10 yards from the build site. It missed the cabin completely but smashed the corner of my lumber pile. A few of the 2X6S had snapped under the weight. If I'd been working late into the night, it could have hit me. The thought made my stomach twist. I spent the next 2 days cutting the tree up with my chainsaw, stacking the logs to dry. My progress on the cabin slowed. The rain kept coming in short waves, and I kept having to stop and recover the frame. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the footprints. One morning, I noticed a set of boot prints in the mud near the edge of my tent. At first, I thought they were mine, but the stride was too wide, and the boots had a different tread pattern. Mine had a square, blocky sole. These had more of a diamond-shaped grip. They circled the tent once, then headed back toward the woods. I stood there for a long time, just staring at them. Could have been a hunter, I told myself. Maybe someone wandering the area. But the idea that someone had walked within a few feet of my tent while I slept, without saying anything, without making any noise, made my skin crawl. That day, I kept my handgun on me. I didn't usually carry it around camp, but something in me shifted. I started moving more cautiously, looking over my shoulder, stopping work more often just to listen. I didn't hear or see anyone. The next morning, I found the cooler moved. It wasn't far, just a few feet from where I'd left it, but it was tilted and partially opened. Something had taken one of the vacuum-sealed bacon packs. No bear tracks, no claw marks, just boot prints, the same tread, in the mud nearby. That evening, I put together a simple latch system on the cabin frame and locked some tools inside. I didn't want to risk losing everything. The floor was done, the walls halfway up. I still had no roof. Then came the worst night of rain. It started just after dark. Wind howled through the trees, and the rain came down sideways. My tarp shook so violently that I had to go out with rope and tie it to a couple extra trees. My flashlight flickered as I did it, the batteries starting to go. Back in the tent, I tried to dry off and eat something. The wind didn't let up. Around midnight, I heard it again. That loud snap and crash. Another tree, but this time closer. Much closer. I sat up, heart pounding, listening for anything else. Then came the footsteps. Not animals. Boots. Slow, deliberate. Crunching across wet leaves and needles. Moving closer to the tent. I held my breath. I didn't unzip the flap. I didn't move. My hand was on the pistol. The steps stopped about 10 feet away. Then nothing. I waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. I finally unzipped the flap an inch and looked out. The rain made it hard to see anything beyond the beam of the flashlight, but I didn't see anyone. I stepped out, shivering, and did a full circle around the tent. No one. No new prints I could see. Just the steady tap of rain and the smell of wet pine. The next morning, I saw it. The cabin door was open. I hadn't left it like that. Inside, the tools were untouched, but my backup food stash was gone. I'd kept some dry goods, rice, canned beans, jerky, in a sealed tub. The tub was still there, but the lid was off and half the contents were missing. I packed everything that day, threw it in the truck and drove into town. Muddy roads be damned. I found a hardware store and bought a cheap trail camera. A couple, actually. I also got better locks, a heavier tarp, and new batteries. I came back the next day, reset everything, and mounted the cameras high up on trees facing the tent and the cabin. I stayed one more night. No rain, no noise, just silence. 2 days later, I checked the footage. One camera had caught him. A man, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark rain jacket and camo pants. Beard. Hood up. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was walking around the tent, same as the prints. He came by at least 3 times, different nights. Always late. Always watching. I didn't finish the cabin. I sold the land 2 months later. I told people it was because of the rain, the isolation, the damage from the storm. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that someone had been watching me for days in that forest. They didn't steal my tools. They didn't burn anything down. They just watched, moved my stuff, took food, walked around while I slept. I never caught him, never saw him in person. but I still see his face sometimes. In my mind, in flashes, in dreams. I live in a small house now, back in the city. It's loud, crowded, full of lights and cars. I used to hate it. Now I'm grateful for every sound, every single one. I was 34 the year I stayed in that old cabin in northern Arizona. I had taken a leave from work after burning out at my job in Flagstaff. I'd been doing contract surveying, land plots, utility plans, commercial builds. Long hours, mostly alone, and half the time I was out in the field with nothing but topo maps and a laptop. My back was always sore. My eyes stung from staring at screens. I was angry too often, snapping at my dog, short with my friends. So when I had a chance to take 2 months off, I grabbed it. A buddy of mine had inherited a piece of land in the Kaibab National Forest. Came with a rough old cabin on it, no power, no plumbing, not even a well. Just a wood stove for walls and a tin roof that clanged when the wind hit right. It was about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. His dad had used it for hunting decades ago, but it had mostly just sat there collecting dust. My buddy offered it to me if I wanted somewhere quiet. I said yes without thinking twice. I packed up what I needed for a few weeks. I brought cans of soup, dry goods, bottled water, a solar charger, and my dog, Bishop, a 6-year-old black lab mix who'd been with me since he was a puppy. I left my phone in the glove box of the truck, parked it under a tarp near the tree lean, and walked the last stretch to the cabin. The air felt clean, cold, but fresh. It was mid-October. The aspens had turned gold, and the days were already getting short. The cabin sat at the edge of a long meadow surrounded by thick pine and fir. Behind it, the land rose into rocky hills dotted with juniper and scrub. You could see for miles in one direction, and in the other you felt like you were swallowed up by the forest. I liked it. It was quiet. The first few days were uneventful. I woke with the sun, made oatmeal on a little propane burner, chopped wood, took long walks, sometimes with Bishop and sometimes alone. I read old paperback novels and scribbled in a notebook. The cabin creaked at night, but that was expected. Rodents in the walls, wind in the trees. I slept well, wrapped in a wool blanket on the old cot. But sometime around the 4th or 5th night, things started to feel off. It was subtle at first. One morning I found Bishop standing stiff at the door, his ears up, eyes locked on the tree lean. Nothing was moving out there. I stood beside him, staring too, but saw nothing. Maybe a coyote had passed through. Maybe he caught the scent of a deer, but his tail wasn't wagging. He looked tense. I opened the door and he didn't bolt outside like he usually did. Just stood there, watching. That day I stayed closer to the cabin. I kept my axe nearby. I thought maybe a mountain lion had come down from higher ground. I'd seen signs of elk and wild pigs, but nothing dangerous. Still, I paid more attention to the silence between the trees. I started looking over my shoulder more when I walked through the woods. That night, Bishop growled low in his throat as we lay in bed. It was after midnight. I sat up and heard it 2 footsteps. Not an animal. Heavy, bipedal, crunching through the dead leaves behind the cabin. Then they stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Bishop was standing now, his back arched, hair up. I waited a full minute before I eased over to the window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. Nothing. I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I circled the cabin looking for prints. The ground was dry, but I found one faint impression in the dirt boot tread. Not mine. Too small. I wear size 12s, and this was maybe a 9. Narrow. I looked around for more, but the leaves had fallen thick. Nothing else. I didn't have a phone, but I had a hand crank radio and an emergency beacon stashed in my bag. I told myself not to panic. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe they saw the cabin and walked by during the night. But if that were true, why didn't they knock? Why sneak around out back? Why stop moving the moment they were near the window? That night, I barricaded the door with the table. I kept my axe beside the bed and stoked the fire high. Bishop wouldn't lie down. He sat beside me, eyes wide open, head twitching at every sound. The wind moaned through the trees, but I didn't hear footsteps.
No growls.
Nothing. The next morning, Bishop refused to go outside. I had to leash him and drag him out the door to do his business. He kept looking over his shoulder the whole time. Something in his body said danger, even if my brain kept trying to reason it away. On the 8th day, I found something strange. I had hiked a few miles down the trail that led toward an old hunting blind I'd found earlier in the week. The air was sharp, clear. I'd brought my binoculars and was scanning for deer, but on the trail back, near a bend in the path where the ground dipped low, I found something hanging from a branch. It was a dead jackrabbit, strung up by its back legs with twine. Its belly had been split and its insides scooped out. Its head was twisted backward. I stopped walking and stared at it for a long time.
I've hunted. I've cleaned rabbits.
This wasn't that. This was a message. Something meant to unnerve. And it worked. I pulled my knife and cut it down. The twine was old, weathered, like it had come from a rancher's tool shed. I threw the rabbit into the brush and backed away, looking all around. The forest was silent. That night, I lit the lantern and kept it burning until morning. Every time I started to doze off, I'd wake to some imagined sound. A crunch of leaves, a footstep, a breath. But I told myself it was just nerves, just wind, just the fire settling in the stove. On the 10th day, Bishop disappeared. It happened in the late afternoon. I'd let him out to piss while I stacked wood along the east wall. Usually, he stayed nearby, chasing squirrels or sniffing at chipmunk holes. But after a while, I realized I hadn't seen him. I called for him, soft at first, then louder. Nothing. I searched until dark. I circled the cabin with a flashlight, calling into the trees. No sound, no movement, no sign of him at all. I barely slept. I sat on the porch with the light on and the axe across my lap. I watched the trees, waiting, listening. In the morning, I packed a bag with water and jerky and went looking again. I made wide circles around the cabin. I followed game trails and ridgelines. I called until my throat was raw. By noon, I found tracks. Dog prints, definitely his, but not alone. There were boot prints too, the same ones I'd seen before, smaller than mine. The two sets moved together for a while, then split. The boot prints continued northeast. Bishop's tracks doubled back, looped, stopped, then nothing. I walked for 2 more hours before I came upon a clearing near a rock outcrop. I froze. There was a small fire pit, smoldering, still warm. A few bones beside it, charred. Something that looked like an old sleeping bag rolled under a cedar. A backpack half buried in needles. And hanging from a branch above the fire was Bishop's collar. Clean. No blood.
No teeth marks.
Just the tag glinting in the sun. I stood there for a long time, afraid to move, afraid to think. Then I turned and walked back to the cabin. Fast. Not running, just fast. That night I didn't light a fire. I kept the windows covered, sat in the dark, listening. I didn't cry, couldn't. I was too full of fear. Around midnight I heard it again. Footsteps, but closer this time, right outside the wall. Slow, deliberate, a scrape of something against the wood. Then silence, then a sound that made my skin go cold. It was Bishop's bark, but it wasn't right. It was too slow, stretched out, like someone trying to mimic a dog and failing. A human throat trying to make a dog sound. Low, croaky, then nothing. I didn't sleep. I waited with my axe in my hands until the sun came up. By morning, I made a decision. I packed everything. I filled my pack, strapped on my gear, and left the cabin behind. I didn't care about the food or the extra clothes. I left the rest. I walked fast back toward the truck. The air felt still, thick, like it was watching. 3 times on that walk, I thought I heard something behind me. Branches snapping, dry leaves crushed underfoot. But when I turned, the woods were empty. I kept moving. I didn't stop to rest. When I finally reached the tarp where my truck was hidden, I felt a wave of relief. I climbed in, turned the key, and it started. I peeled the tarp off the windshield, drove onto the dirt path, and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I never went back for the rest of my stuff. Later, when I told my buddy about it, he just nodded, said the land up there was strange, said there were stories, old ones. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. It's been almost 4 years now. I still think about it at night. I still wonder what was out there. Not a ghost, not a monster, just something human, something wrong. Someone who'd been living out in that forest too long. Watching, listening, waiting. I never found Bishop. And I know deep down that whatever was out there, it wanted me to stay just a little longer. But I didn't. I got out, and I won't ever go back. I was 32 when I booked a remote cabin for a long weekend in the early fall of 2019. My job in software development had me sitting behind a screen too many hours a day, and after a long project had wrapped up, I needed something quiet and disconnected. I didn't want to be near cities or even small towns. I just wanted trees, wind, and maybe a few beers at night by a fire. I found this place online, listed on an old site that wasn't even one of the big rental companies. It looked run down in the photos, weathered with siding, a sagging front porch, and a rusted metal chimney pipe, but it had a fireplace, solar power, and a wood stove, and it said there was a creek nearby and good hiking. The price was absurdly low for 3 nights. There was one odd thing. It was listed as being located next to a disused cemetery. The listing mentioned it like it was a charming novelty, something steeped in local history. I didn't care. I wasn't superstitious. Dead people don't scare me. Living ones do. The place was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived in Arkansas, outside of a place called Franklin Ridge. Not much there but some farms, a few gas stations, and an old bait shop by the edge of town. From there, it was another 30-minute drive along a dirt road that climbed into the hills. It was mid-September when I went up. The leaves were just beginning to turn. The last mile of the drive was rough, deep ruts, washed-out sections, and branches scratching the sides of my truck. But I finally reached the cabin late that Friday afternoon. It was exactly like the photos, gray, weathered boards, a porch with 2 busted-up chairs, and a narrow chimney pipe sticking out the side like a bent finger. There was a gravel turnout where I parked. The cabin sat on a slope above the road, and behind it, through the thinning trees, I saw an old, uneven fence made of iron rods barely standing up straight. That was the graveyard. From where I stood, I could already see several crooked headstones, some of them barely higher than the grass. I walked around the cabin first. There was a woodpile stacked behind it, and an axe leaning against the porch rail. The door creaked when I opened it, and inside, the place smelled of old wood and dust. The floor was uneven. The walls looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years, and a few cobwebs hung from the corners. There was a small kitchen area with a gas burner, a little solar-powered fridge, and a chipped sink. The water pump worked surprisingly. The bedroom had a twin bed with a worn-out mattress and a sleeping bag rolled up on top. The bathroom was just a composting toilet in a shed behind the cabin. There was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, just me, the trees, and the dead. I dropped my pack and opened a beer. then walked out to the fence behind the cabin to check out the cemetery. It was bigger than I expected. Maybe 20 or 30 headstones, many of them cracked or leaning. A few graves had sunk into the ground like shallow pits. I noticed a handful of names repeated: Baker, Ellis, Porter. A family plot, most likely. The most recent marker I saw had a date from 1942. Others went back into the late 1800s. One grave near the back stood out. It didn't have a proper headstone, just a large rock sticking up out of the earth with no name, just the faint scratch of what looked like initials. The fence around the graveyard was broken in several places, and it looked like deer or other animals had been moving through it. I stood there for a while. It was quiet, too quiet. Not just the usual forest quiet. There were no birds, no squirrels chattering, just wind and trees. Even the creek I'd read about was silent. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just the time of day. That first night, I made a fire in the ring out front and cooked some sausage on a skillet. It got cold fast after sunset. I bundled up, drank a couple more beers, and watched the stars. At some point, I heard what sounded like a branch snapping behind the cabin. Not a small twig, something big. I froze and listened. Nothing else followed it. Probably a deer. I went inside around 10 and locked the door. There was a thick metal bolt on it, which seemed unnecessary way out here, but I used it anyway. The wind picked up overnight. The cabin creaked and groaned with every gust. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to what sounded like someone walking on the porch. Heavy, slow steps. I held my breath. The steps went from one side of the porch to the other, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't even get up to look. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a bear or a raccoon. Still, I didn't sleep the rest of the night. In the morning, I went outside and checked. The porch was clear. No footprints, but the boards were scuffed. Could have been from me earlier, I wasn't sure. I hiked down to the creek to distract myself. It was just a narrow trickle of water in a rocky gully, but the walk helped settle me. By midday, I was calm again. That afternoon, I decided to explore the graveyard more. I took my camera and tried to get some close-up shots of the older stones. Some were covered in moss so thick you couldn't read anything. I found one that had been split in half, and another that had fallen over completely. I kept getting this strange feeling, like I was being watched, but every time I turned around, nothing was there. One thing that really started to bother me was a set of small holes near a group of graves in the back corner, about the size of golf balls going straight into the ground. At first, I thought they were animal burrows, maybe moles, but they were too uniform. I counted 11 of them in a straight line, leading toward the woods behind the graveyard. When I followed the direction they pointed, I noticed an old trail that wasn't visible from the cabin. It was overgrown, narrow, and rocky, leading deeper into the trees. I didn't go far down it, just enough to see that it continued well beyond what I could walk that late in the day. There were broken boards and what looked like the remains of an old fence further in. That night, I built another fire, ate some canned chili, kept my flashlight and axe beside me. I couldn't shake that feeling that something wasn't right. At around 1 a.m., I was half asleep when I heard the porch again. Same heavy steps. This time, I got up. I stood near the door and waited. Then I heard the distinct sound of something dragging across the wooden planks, like a shovel or maybe a metal tool. The steps went to the far side of the cabin, near the back. I stayed inside, didn't even look through the windows. I don't know how long it went on. The sound eventually faded. I sat on the edge of the bed with my axe in my hand until the sky began to lighten. When I finally opened the door the next morning, I found a trail of small holes, same as the ones in the graveyard, only now they were leading from the side of the cabin out toward the cemetery, like someone or something had been digging. I followed them. They curved around the cabin, cut straight through the graveyard, and then disappeared at the edge of the woods. The worst part was the smell. the kind of sour, earthy smell you get from digging up wet soil, or worse. There was also a spot near the back where one of the sunken graves looked different, fresher. The dirt had been disturbed. That was when I made the decision to leave early. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out of there. I packed everything up and loaded the truck. I didn't even finish my coffee. Just as I was about to get in, I noticed something by the trail I'd found the day before. There was a piece of cloth hanging from a branch. Dirty, faded blue, looked like part of a shirt. I walked over and saw more bits of fabric, some bones, animal bones, I hoped, scattered around the trailhead. There was an old metal bucket, rusted through, and what looked like a length of rope nailed to a tree. It had been used for something. I didn't stay long enough to find out what. I drove fast back down the hill, hit a stump at one point and nearly cracked an axle, but I didn't stop. Once I got back to the main road, I finally pulled over and tried to collect myself. I made it home that afternoon, shaken, exhausted, and still trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Later that week, I did some research. I found a couple old references to the area near Franklin Ridge. Back in the 1930s, there were rumors of a man who lived alone in those hills, someone who'd been chased out of town for digging up graves. He wasn't caught, just disappeared. The cemetery had been used by a single family, and when they died off, the land was left to rot. The cabin, as it turned out, wasn't built as a rental. It was once a caretaker's house for whoever looked after the graves. But the last caretaker died in 1943. No one took over after that. The site fell off the maps. That was the last thing I read. I haven't gone camping alone since. And every now and then, I still dream about those little holes in the ground, like something buried was trying to find its way back up. Whatever was out there that weekend, I don't think it was a ghost. I think it was a man, maybe not even alive in the usual sense, but a man all the same, living out in those woods, dragging something heavy across the porch of that rotting cabin, waiting for people like me to get too close to what was buried and forgotten. I got lucky. I left, but I don't think everyone did, and I'll never go back. I had just turned 31 the month before I went out to the farm. It was September 2019. I was living in Boise, Idaho at the time, but a cousin of mine, Trevor, had moved back to our grandfather's old property near Pinedale, Wyoming. He and his wife had a newborn, and they were trying to fix up the land and make it livable again. The house was still standing but rough. A few old sheds were collapsing, and there was a small hunting cabin about a quarter-mile off from the main house, tucked back in some trees, closer to the western fence line. I was between jobs. I'd been laid off from a logistics company, and the severance wasn't bad, but I didn't have anything lined up yet. I figured a couple of weeks in the quiet would help. Plus, I owed Trevor a few favors. He said I could stay in the little cabin out back as long as I helped him with some fencing and kept an eye on things while they drove down to Salt Lake for a few days. They had doctor appointments for the baby and wanted to spend a couple nights away. The drive from Boise to the farm was about 5 hours. I got there around 3 in the afternoon. The sky was cloudless, a deep high blue with that early fall crispness. The land was flat for the most part, but there were small dips and curves where water used to run. The cabin looked pretty much like I remembered it from childhood, though back then it always gave me the creeps. It was just a one-room structure, barely big enough for a bed, a table, and a chair.
No plumbing.
A propane heater sat crooked on the far wall. There was an outhouse about 50 yards away and an old water pump that might still work if the ground wasn't too hard. Trevor met me in the main yard, and we talked for a bit while he showed me what he'd been working on. Fixing gates, cutting brush, clearing out old barbed wire. After a while, he helped me bring a cot, sleeping bag, and a few supplies into the cabin. The place was full of spider webs and mouse droppings. I swept it out the best I could and dumped 2 bug bombs before walking back to the house. We ate dinner with his wife, then they packed up and left just before dark. I went back to the cabin with a flashlight, my pack, and a small cooler. The cot was still airing out, and the place smelled like pesticides, but I was too tired to care. I laid down and listened to the wind in the grass and the slight creak of the walls. That first night was uneventful. I woke up once or twice from old noises, the kind of small scuffs and clicks a building makes when it settles. Still, it was peaceful. I made a pot of instant coffee over a small propane stove I'd brought and sat out on the steps the next morning watching the land light up slowly. Over the next 2 days, I settled into a rhythm. I'd wake early, walk the fence lines, take some notes on downed wire or broken posts, and eat lunch back at the cabin. There was no cell service, no internet, and barely any signal even if I walked a few hundred yards uphill. I didn't mind. Felt like stepping back in time, and the quiet helped me think. I read old books I'd packed, did some push-ups in the dirt behind the outhouse, and made campfire meals from canned beans and sausages. I didn't mind the solitude. It wasn't until the 3rd day that I started noticing things that felt off. That morning, I hiked down to the southeast fence, where an old cattle gate had dropped. As I walked the line, I saw what looked like boot prints leading out of the woods and across the field. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh enough to be Trevor's. They looked a couple days old at least, maybe more. The tread was deep, like from a heavy work boot, and the steps were long. Whoever it was had walked along the inside of the property for a bit, then crossed over the fence heading east. I followed them for a few minutes, but they disappeared in a patch of taller grass. That night, I couldn't sleep well. I kept thinking about those prints. The farm had no neighbors for miles. The closest property was an abandoned sawmill about 4 miles away. The boots didn't look like they belonged to anyone passing through. They looked deliberate, like someone walking the fence and checking it. That thought stuck with me. The next day, I woke up and found the door to the outhouse wide open. I always latched it shut. Always. The wind could have blown it, sure, but it hadn't been windy the night before. Still, I closed it and latched it again. Later that afternoon, I was walking the west fence line near the tree line when I saw something shiny on the ground. I bent down and found a used cigarette butt. Still smelled fresh. I don't smoke, and Trevor doesn't either. There was no trash around it, no other signs of someone staying there. But that single cigarette on dirt that hadn't seen people in days told me someone was watching. That evening, I brought my gear into the cabin early and bolted the door from the inside using an old metal latch. There was no window glass, just wooden shutters. So I shut them tight and pulled a blanket over the bottom half of the door where moonlight leaked through the gap. I stayed up most of the night listening. Every crackle in the brush outside made me sit up. I could swear I heard footsteps once or twice, but nothing definite. Eventually, I dozed off around 4 a.m. In the morning, I went to the outhouse and noticed something carved into the back wall. It hadn't been there before, I was certain. It was a simple X, long, rough cuts made with something sharp. Not new, but fresh enough to flake. I stood there looking at it for a long time. I tried to tell myself it had been there before, that I'd missed it, but I knew I hadn't. That day, I walked the entire property, every fence, every trail, even the creek bed behind the barn. I didn't find anything else out of place, but I had that feeling the whole time, that feeling like someone's watching you from behind, standing too far back for you to hear, but just close enough to know you're not alone. That night, I brought a crowbar and kept it next to the cot. I stayed inside with the lantern low. I didn't hear anything for hours. It was a still night, warmer than the last few. Around 2:30 in the morning, I heard a branch crack behind the cabin. A single snap, loud, close. I sat up and held my breath. Another crack, then nothing. I waited, frozen, listening. After what felt like forever, I crept to the shutter and cracked it just enough to see through. There was nothing out there, no movement.
Nos chaps.
I stayed like that for 20 minutes. Then I saw it. Someone standing in the trees, just on the edge of where the moonlight hit the grass. A tall figure, still almost blending into the trunk behind them. No light, no sound, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might give me away. After about 10 minutes, they turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed my gear before the sun came up. I walked the quarter-mile to the main house and waited there until Trevor got back that evening. I didn't say much. I told him I wasn't feeling great, that I might head out early. He didn't ask questions. I helped him unload groceries, said goodbye to his wife and kid, and left before dark. On the drive home, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I kept thinking about the boots, the cigarette, the carving, and that figure in the trees. Whoever it was hadn't done anything yet, but they'd been close, too close. I never told Trevor the full story. I didn't want to spook them, but I haven't gone back since. Not to that cabin. Sometimes when I'm in bed late at night and I think about those days, I remember how quiet everything was, how still the land felt. But I also remember how that quiet could hide things. The way a person could stand 20 yards away in the dark and not make a sound. The way a simple X on a wall could be a message. That cabin is still out there. So is whoever was watching it. And maybe that's all they ever wanted, to watch. But maybe not. Either way, I don't need to find out. I spent the fall of 2019 in the Scottish Highlands, alone. I was 33 back then, burnt out from work, going through the aftermath of a breakup that I wasn't handling well. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just that I needed time away. I had rented a small wooden cabin about 20 miles outside of Fort William. It was tucked into a dense forest, set back from a gravel track that twisted and dipped through the trees. No neighbors nearby, just quiet, cold air and isolation. The place had been listed on some obscure travel blog as a perfect off-grid getaway. It was basic, just a single room with a bed, a little table, a propane stove, and a wood-burning heater. There was a compost toilet out back in a small shed and a solar panel for minimal electricity. No internet, no phone service. That was part of the draw. I brought a few paperbacks, a notebook, and enough food to last a couple of weeks. The first few days were peaceful. I went for long walks through the mossy forest, sometimes venturing down towards the loch, where the water was cold and still. I'd make tea, read until the light faded, and sleep early. Nights were longer than I was used to, complete darkness after sunset. Sometimes I'd sit by the little stove and stare into the flames for hours, thinking about nothing and everything. But things started to feel strange around the fourth or fifth night. It began with small noises outside the cabin, twigs snapping, footsteps crunching leaves. I assumed it was deer, maybe a fox. I told myself the woods had their own rhythm, and I wasn't used to it. But I noticed the way the sounds would stop as soon as I moved, like something was watching me through the cracks between the wooden planks. That thought made me feel colder than the night air. I started locking the door at night, even though it was just a sliding latch. I'd shut the curtains, even though the cabin was surrounded by pitch black. I kept telling myself it was just nerves, just my imagination, but that feeling wouldn't leave. The quiet had shifted from peaceful to uneasy. A couple days later, I decided to take a longer walk to a ridge I had seen on the map. I packed some water, snacks, and left around mid-morning. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a compass and a printed map. It was about 5 miles uphill through thick pine and birch. As I got higher, I could see the loch far below, the cabin just a brown speck tucked between trees. It was beautiful in a desolate kind of way. Cold wind pressed against my jacket. No people, no voices, just the sound of trees shifting, birds darting through the branches. On the way back down, I came across something strange. There was an old path that veered off to the side, overgrown but still visible. I hadn't seen it on the way up. I followed it for about 200 yards just out of curiosity. That's when I saw it, a second cabin, smaller than mine, weathered gray, half swallowed by moss and vines. Its windows were boarded up, door slightly open, no obvious trail leading to it. It looked abandoned. I didn't go inside. I had no real reason to. I just stared at it from a distance. There was something off about the shape, like it had been built quickly, carelessly. The roof sagged. The boards looked nailed in from the outside, not inside. That stuck with me. When I got back to my own cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about that other one. Why wasn't it listed on the maps? Who had lived there? Why board up the windows from outside? That night, I didn't sleep well. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up sweating, though the air was freezing. I felt like someone was standing just outside the door. I stared at the handle, frozen in bed. I didn't hear footsteps, but I knew something was there. I waited in silence for almost an hour, ears straining, heart thudding. When I finally got up the courage to check, there was nothing outside, just darkness and fog. The next morning, I found fresh tracks around the cabin. They weren't mine. I wore thick rubber boots. These were different, smaller, lighter, barefoot maybe. I crouched down and touched one of the prints, still damp. I looked up into the trees, suddenly aware of how alone I was. No one should have been out there, not that far into the woods. I spent most of that day inside. I kept the fire going, read the same page of a book 10 times. I couldn't focus. By the time evening came, I was thinking of leaving, maybe hiking back to the main road early and catching a ride. But something in me wanted to stay, wanted to prove it was all in my head. That night, I saw her. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep again. The fire had burned low. I rolled over to look out the window, and that's when I saw her, a woman, standing perfectly still about 20 feet from the cabin, half lit by moonlight. She wasn't moving. She wore a long coat or dress. Couldn't tell which. Her hair looked thin and wet, hanging down past her shoulders. She was staring straight at me. I didn't move. My body locked up. I watched her for what felt like hours. No sound, no motion. She didn't walk closer, just stood there, eyes locked on mine. Then, slowly, she turned and walked into the trees. Her movement was stiff, unnatural, like her joints didn't bend properly. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed up until dawn, every noise outside setting off alarm bells. When the light came, I stepped outside with a knife from the kitchen drawer. No sign of her, but there were footprints again, this time circling the entire cabin. Light prints, same shape, same size. I packed my bag. I didn't care about the rental terms or losing money. I just needed to leave. I stuffed food, my map, my notebook into the bag and started walking. I planned to hike all the way back to Fort William. I didn't want to be near that place another night, but something made me stop by the other cabin again. I don't know why. Curiosity, maybe, or a need to understand. I approached slowly, keeping an eye on the door, still slightly open. The boards on the windows looked older now, more fragile. I stepped up onto the warped porch. The wood creaked under my boots. I pushed the door fully open. The air inside was thick and musty. It smelled like damp rot and old clothes. The cabin was even smaller than mine. Just one room with a broken table and a mattress on the floor. There were newspapers on the wall like wallpaper, old clippings, 1990s, maybe earlier. Headlines about missing people. A child gone from Inverness. A hiker who disappeared near Ben Nevis. In the far corner, there was a pile of clothes. Women's clothes. Moldy, torn. Next to them, a mirror leaned against the wall. It was cracked, smeared with something dark. A single photo was wedged into the broken frame. It was of a woman. Her face was pale, almost expressionless. Thin lips, wide eyes, wet hair hanging over her shoulders. The same woman I had seen outside the night before. Same dead stare. I backed out of the cabin slowly. Didn't touch anything else. I hiked for hours that day, never looking back. I made it to a small road and waited until a local farmer passed in a muddy Land Rover. He gave me a confused look when I flagged him down, but didn't ask questions. Drove me all the way to the train station. I never went back. I didn't tell the rental company anything. I didn't report the other cabin. I didn't call the police. I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make me sound insane. A woman standing outside in the woods isn't a crime. Neither is an abandoned shack. But I kept thinking about the photo, the newspaper clippings, the way the cabin looked lived in, not abandoned. A few weeks later, I did some digging online. I searched for missing people in that part of Scotland. There were a few cases over the years, tourists, hikers, solo travelers. No clear pattern, nothing ever found. But one stood out, a woman named Elsie Monroe. She'd vanished in 2001, mid-30s, last seen heading to a remote cabin near Fort William, a place she rented to get away from everything. That's how the article put it. Her photo wasn't online. The article was old. Just text, no images. But I know what I saw. She's still out there. Or someone is. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was someone who found her, who watched her the same way they watched me. Maybe I was lucky. I think about that night often. The way she stood there, the stiffness in her arms, the blank stare that locked me in place. I wonder how long she'd been watching me before I noticed. I wonder if she came to the window while I was asleep, if she was inside the cabin at any point. I'll never know, but I haven't gone camping since, and I never will again. I was 33 the year I decided to spend a week alone in a cabin I rented up in northwestern Montana. It was the summer of 2017. I had recently gone through a rough patch, burned out from work, a relationship that didn't end well, and I was starting to feel like I'd lost track of myself. I didn't tell many people where I was going, just my brother and one friend from work. I needed the isolation. The cabin was deep in Flathead County, about an hour-and-a-half drive northwest of Kalispell. You had to take a long gravel road up past a dried-out logging trail and then hike another mile from where the road ended. It sat near the edge of a broad clearing, facing a wall of dense pine forest. The tree line started maybe 40 yards from the porch. Beyond that, miles and miles of wilderness. I found it on a website that advertised off-grid vacation spots. It was a small, one-room wooden structure with a loft, a cast-iron stove, an old table with mismatched chairs, and a cot. No electricity.
No plumbing.
Just a water pump a few feet from the cabin and a composting toilet built into a little outhouse down a short trail behind the cabin. There was no cell service at all, which I wanted. I brought everything I needed: canned food, water filters, a solar lantern, books, my old journal, and a .357 revolver I kept locked away unless I was sleeping or hiking. I didn't like guns, but I was alone, and there were black bears in that part of the country. Maybe even a grizzly or two, though I knew they didn't usually come this far west unless food was scarce. The first 2 days were perfect. I hiked, chopped some wood, made fires, and cooked over the stove. I'd wake up with the sun, sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, and listen to the wind moving through the trees. That was what I came for, the quiet. I hadn't heard a car, a voice, or even a plane since I'd parked and hiked in. Felt like I'd gone back 100 years. On the third night, I noticed something strange. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a sound. A soft, cracking branch from somewhere near the tree line while I was sitting out on the porch finishing the last of my canned chili. I didn't think much of it, probably a deer or a raccoon, but I stopped eating for a second and listened. There was nothing else, just that one branch. No footsteps, no more movement. I waited a few more minutes, looking out toward the trees. It was darker than usual that night. Cloud cover.
Nomon.
Eventually, I went inside and locked the door like I always did. The next morning, I found boot prints near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine. I knew that for sure. My boots left a distinct tread with a worn heel. These were different. Wider set, more square, heavier. They looked fresh too, not like something from days ago. I stood there for a while, looking down at them. They came out of the trees, stopped about 20 feet into the clearing, then turned around and went back the way they came. That was the first time I felt uneasy. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The closest house was probably 15 or 20 miles away, and the trail to the cabin wasn't marked. You had to really be looking to find this place. I hadn't heard a car or ATV either. I walked along the trail to see if maybe someone had parked farther down and hiked up, but there was no sign of anyone. No new tire tracks. Nothing. I went back to the cabin, trying not to let it bother me, but it did. That day, I kept the revolver on my hip while I moved around. I didn't go far from the cabin. I kept my ears open and didn't use my headphones when I chopped more wood. I wanted to hear everything. Nothing happened for the rest of the day. That night, I locked the door and closed the shutters, which I hadn't done before. I kept the lantern low and sat at the table writing in my journal, but I couldn't focus. Every few minutes, I would glance at the window or pause to listen. It was around 1 a.m. when I heard the second noise. A long, slow creak, like someone stepping on the porch outside. I froze. My hand went to the revolver immediately. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. I sat completely still, listening with every part of me. The creak didn't come again. There was no knock, no shadow under the door, no voice, just silence. I waited for what felt like an hour, gun in my hand, heart pounding, but it stayed quiet. Eventually, I moved to the cot and sat there with the lantern off. I didn't sleep. I just sat there until morning came. The next day, I checked the porch. Nothing.
No boot prints. No scoof marks.
But I know what I heard. I started to consider hiking out. The food I had would last me longer, and I hadn't planned to leave for a few more days, but something was wrong. I just didn't know what. I didn't want to seem paranoid, and I hated the idea of running from nothing, but being out there with no cell service and nobody nearby started to feel stupid. I decided to stay one more night. If anything else happened, I'd leave in the morning. That afternoon, I cleaned the revolver, packed a small bag with essentials in case I needed to leave fast, and kept the rest of my gear organized near the door. I left the axe by the porch and brought the lantern inside early. I ate a cold dinner. I didn't want to light the stove or fire that night. Just before sunset, I stepped out to the porch and looked at the tree line. There was a man standing there. He was far enough away that I couldn't see his face, but he wasn't moving, just standing at the edge of the trees, not in the open, but where the shadows started. He wasn't wearing any bright colors, just dark clothes, maybe a hat. It was hard to tell in the fading light, but I saw him. I stared for a few seconds, then slowly stepped back inside and closed the door. I didn't panic. I just moved. I locked the door, turned off the lantern, pulled the revolver from the bag and sat in the corner behind the table, where I could see the door and hear the porch if anyone came up. I sat there until it was completely dark. I didn't hear anything. No creak this time, no steps, just the usual sounds of the forest at night. But I knew he was still out there. Eventually, I fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. When I woke up, the sun was already up. I opened the door slowly, looked around. Nothing. I stepped outside. There was something on the porch. a little pile of stones, 4 of them stacked neatly right next to the door. I hadn't put them there. No way. That was it for me. I grabbed my pack, left most of my gear behind, and started down the trail. I didn't run, but I moved fast. I had the revolver in my waistband and kept glancing behind me every couple minutes. I didn't stop until I reached my car. It was untouched. I got in and drove. I didn't go home right away. I stopped at a small gas station closer to Kalispell and told the clerk there was someone hanging around a cabin I'd rented. He just nodded and said people had been reporting squatters and off-grid weirdos out in that direction for a while now. Some guys living in the woods permanently. He didn't seem surprised. I reported the incident to the sheriff's department that afternoon. They took a statement but didn't seem interested. Just said they'd check it out. I never heard back from them. I never went back for my gear. A few weeks later, I looked up the listing for the cabin. It had been taken down. When I contacted the website, they told me the owner had removed it after several incidents were reported, but they wouldn't give details. It's been years now, but I still think about that man. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he was there or what he wanted. But I know this: he wasn't lost. He wasn't a hiker. He wasn't a hunter. He came to that cabin on purpose. And he waited. I don't camp alone anymore. I don't even hike without a partner. And sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I can still see him there at the tree line, watching, waiting, just barely hidden in the dark. I was 31 when I took that trip. It was October 2022. I'd been working in a small mechanic shop just outside of Flagstaff, Arizona, and had been on my feet nonstop for weeks. That month, for some reason, we had a ton of customers coming through with old trucks, busted axles, overheating issues, everything you could think of. By the time the 20th rolled around, I was burnt out. I needed a break, something quiet, somewhere far. I found this listing online for a remote cabin out near the Kaibab National Forest. It was about a 2-hour drive from where I lived, nestled off a service road that looked like it hadn't been maintained in a while. No cell service, no Wi-Fi, just an off-grid wood cabin with a wood stove, a rain barrel, and solar power for lights. The pictures showed a little deck, a fire pit, and dense woods all around. It was perfect. I booked 3 nights, Thursday to Sunday. I decided to take my dog, Birch, with me. He was a mutt, some mix of lab and shepherd, but loyal as hell. He was 6 then, mellow but alert. He loved the outdoors more than I did, and the idea of being out there alone didn't worry me as much with him next to me. I knew he'd hear or smell anything before I would. I packed the truck that Thursday morning. A cooler full of food, extra water jugs, sleeping bag, propane for the portable stove, and my old hunting knife. I also brought a .38 revolver I kept locked away in a case, mostly for bears or mountain lions, though I doubted I'd need it. Still, something about going that far off-grid makes you double-check things. We hit the road at 9 a.m. Birch stuck his head out the window most of the ride, tongue out, nose twitching. It was mostly highway until I hit the smaller roads that led into the forest. From there, the roads narrowed and got rougher, until I was crawling down a rutted trail in 4-wheel drive, tires popping over rocks and fallen pine branches. By the time I saw the cabin, it was just past 1:30 p.m. It looked exactly like the pictures. A single-story log structure, a steep green tin roof, and a small porch facing a slope that dropped down into thick woods. There were no other cabins in sight, nothing but tall pines and silence. I parked off to the side and let Birch out. He bounded around, sniffing everything, tail wagging. Inside was one room. A bed, a table, a couple chairs, a small shelf with books and flashlights, and a cast iron wood stove in the corner. There was a manual pump at the sink, fed by the rain barrel outside. It was basic but clean. It smelled like cedar and dust. I spent the afternoon unloading, stacking the firewood, checking the outhouse, and stretching my legs with Birch. Around 5, I started a fire in the pit, heated up some chili, and sat outside with my dog by my side. We listened to the wind pushing through the trees, the crackling of fire, and nothing else. That first night I slept hard, but I didn't stay asleep. Something woke me just after 3 a.m. It wasn't loud, just different. A creak, or maybe a soft thud from outside. Birch lifted his head too. His ears perked and his body stiffened. He didn't bark, but he stared at the window in the dark, eyes alert, breathing steady. I didn't move at first. I just listened. Another creak, like a footstep on the porch. Not the wind, not an animal. Too heavy. Birch stayed locked in position. I slid the revolver from the case next to the bed and stayed still. I didn't turn on a light. If someone was out there, I didn't want to let them see me first. Minutes passed. Nothing else happened. Birch eventually lay back down, but I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. There were no boot prints on the porch, just leaves and dirt. I chalked it up to the cabin settling or maybe a raccoon. Still, it left me with this uneasy feeling. I spent the day hiking with Birch. There was a trail that wound down behind the cabin and looped through the woods, eventually circling back near a stream. The forest was deep and quiet, beautiful but isolating. We didn't see anyone all day. No cars, no other campers, not even signs of people. Just trees, moss, and fallen logs. That afternoon, back at the cabin, I noticed something strange. A piece of firewood had been moved. Just one log, lying beside the stack, almost as if someone had picked it up and put it down again. Birch was sniffing it hard, nose darting around the area, tail stiff. I hadn't touched the pile since stacking it the day before. I picked it up, set it back. Didn't think much of it after that. Maybe it fell. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The second night, I stayed up late, reading by lantern while Birch dozed beside the door. Around midnight, I heard it again. A soft noise outside. A footstep. Then another. Birch jumped up and growled low, his hackles raised. He was staring at the back window now, the one that faced the woods. This time, I crept over and looked out. I didn't see anything at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed movement. A quick flicker between the trees. A shape maybe 50 feet from the cabin. I couldn't tell what it was. It moved like a person, but I couldn't make out details. I grabbed the revolver and stepped to the door, heart pounding. I didn't open it, just waited. Birch growled again. The shape moved again, this time farther away. After a few more minutes, it was gone. I didn't sleep much that night either. In the morning, I found tracks in the soft dirt behind the cabin. Boot prints. Human. They circled the back of the cabin and led off into the trees. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I packed up everything from outside and brought it in. I kept the revolver closer. I even considered driving out, but part of me didn't want to give whoever that was the satisfaction. I decided I'd stay one more night, but I wouldn't sleep. I'd wait, see if they came back. I stayed inside that whole day, only stepping out to let Birch relieve himself. I kept the windows uncovered and sat where I could see both doors. I loaded the revolver. Birch paced a lot, sniffed the door constantly, his tail low, his ears twitching. When night fell, I sat in the dark. No lights, no fire, just Birch and me listening. Hours passed. Then, just after 2:30 a.m., we heard it. Crunch. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. On the porch this time. Birch was frozen, body trembling, eyes locked on the door. I raised the revolver and stayed still. The footsteps stopped. Then something touched the doorknob. A soft rattle. I didn't move. Birch growled deep and low, his lip curled. The doorknob moved again, a little harder. Then nothing. We waited. 10 minutes. 20. I opened the window and peeked out. No one on the porch. But I saw movement again, this time heading back into the woods. I caught a glimpse of a jacket, a silhouette of someone walking away calmly. Not running, just disappearing between the trees. The next morning, I stepped outside with Birch. I walked the perimeter. More boot prints. This time they led farther up the trail. That was it. I'd had enough. I packed up everything by 7 a.m., threw it in the truck, and Birch and I were gone before 8. I didn't look back at the cabin. Back home, I called the local ranger office. I didn't tell them everything, just that someone had been prowling around the cabin at night, that there were footprints, and it made me feel unsafe. The woman I spoke to didn't seem surprised. She said it wasn't the first report like that. They'd had complaints in that area before. Said she'd send someone to check it out. I asked if anyone lived near that cabin. She paused. No one for a few miles. Just woods. I haven't been back since. Sometimes I wonder if whoever that was just watching cabins for fun, or maybe planning something worse. But I always think back to that doorknob turning. Not banging, not breaking in, just checking, careful, patient, like they were waiting for the right night. If Birch hadn't been there, maybe I wouldn't have heard them. Maybe they would have come in. I've gone camping since, but never that far off-grid. I still take Birch with me, and I always keep my ears open. And every now and then, if I'm out past dark and I hear something move in the woods, I remember how quiet that forest was, how someone else was already out there, just watching. I remember the moment I decided to spend a weekend at the cabin like it was yesterday, even though it was already 5 years ago. It was the fall of 2019, and I was 28 years old then. I lived in northern Minnesota, where the woods stretch for miles, full of pine trees and thick brush, the kind of place where you can disappear if you want. I wasn't exactly an outdoorsman, but I liked being alone sometimes, away from the noise and stress of the city and my dead-end job. My uncle had a small, old cabin up north, near a lake called Clearwater. The place wasn't fancy. It had no electricity or running water, just a small wood stove and a propane lantern. The floor creaked in places, and the walls were covered in old wallpaper, faded and peeling. But it was mine to use whenever I wanted, and that weekend, I thought it would be the perfect escape. I packed a small backpack with essentials, some canned food, a bottle of water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a hunting knife my grandfather had given me years ago. No phone service there, which was the point. I wanted to get lost in the silence. The drive up was long, winding through narrow dirt roads surrounded by trees so dense you could barely see the sky. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, and the forest had that golden glow that only fall brings. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I felt a calm I hadn't felt in a long time. I parked near the little dock that stuck out into the lake and unloaded my things. The cabin looked small and lonely, sitting just a few yards back from the water's edge. I spent the first evening chopping some wood, lighting the stove, and setting up my sleeping area on the worn-out cot. The temperature dropped fast once the sun disappeared. The sounds of the forest came alive. Crickets, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl. I had never been scared of the woods, but I respected it. It was wild, unpredictable, and very much alive. As the night deepened, I sat near the window watching the lake, the water smooth and black, reflecting the stars. That's when I first noticed the footprints outside. Muddy, large, leading from the forest toward the cabin and stopping near the back door. I froze, my heart beating fast. I hadn't heard anything, but something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night air was cold and sharp. I followed the prints into the trees, but they disappeared in the thick brush. My skin prickled. I told myself it was probably some animal, maybe a bear or a large dog that had wandered near. Still, I locked all the doors and windows, checked my knife, and tried to calm down. I told myself I was overreacting. The woods were full of animals, nothing else. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me awake. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. The wind through the trees sounded like whispers. I stayed alert, listening for anything unusual. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the area. I packed a small day bag with water and a few snacks and left the cabin around 9 a.m. The sun was bright, and the air smelled fresher than ever. I followed a narrow trail that ran alongside the lake, hoping to find some fishing spots or a good place to sit and think. After walking for about an hour, I found an old hunting blind made of wood, hidden among the trees. It looked abandoned, weathered by years of rain and snow. The smell inside was musty, and the floor was covered in leaves. I felt uneasy, but mostly curious. I took some pictures with my phone, just to show my friends later, and kept moving. Back at the cabin, I made lunch and spent the afternoon reading a book I brought along. Around 4 p.m., the wind picked up, and dark clouds started rolling in. I decided to prepare some firewood for the evening. As I was stacking the logs near the back door, I saw something move just beyond the tree line. It was a man. He was wearing dark clothes, a heavy jacket and jeans, and a baseball cap that shadowed his face. I didn't hear any footsteps before he appeared, like he was watching me from the woods and chose that moment to step out. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. I froze. The man didn't say a word. His eyes were cold, sharp. I stepped back slowly, my heart pounding. The man turned and disappeared into the trees just as quickly as he came. I locked the door and windows again, pulled the curtains, and sat down to think. Who was that? Why was he here? The cabin was private, and there wasn't supposed to be anyone else around. I didn't want trouble, and I definitely didn't want to get involved with some stranger lurking in the woods. That night was worse than the first. I didn't sleep at all. Every sound made me jump. Branches cracking, footsteps crunching, something scraping against the cabin walls. I stayed by the stove with the knife in my hand, trying to stay awake until dawn. The lantern flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. Around midnight, I heard someone trying to open the front door. The handle rattled, but the lock held. I grabbed my knife, my whole body shaking, and looked through the peephole. No one was there, but then I heard footsteps running away, back into the trees. I knew I had to get out. I didn't care about the cabin anymore. My survival instincts kicked in. I grabbed my bag, my knife, and my flashlight, and quietly slipped out the back door. The man might still be nearby. I ran through the woods, the cold air burning my lungs. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get far away from the cabin and whoever was hunting me. Branches whipped against my face, roots caught my feet, but I kept moving. The forest seemed endless, but I finally found a dirt road about half a mile away. It was the same road I had driven in on. I started walking down the road, hoping for a car or some sign of life. The sky was starting to lighten, the first pale pinks of dawn breaking through the trees. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights coming toward me. I waved my arms desperately. The truck stopped, and a man rolled down the window. I told him I was lost and someone was trying to get me at the cabin. He nodded, looked serious, and offered to drive me back to town. Back in town, I went straight to the sheriff's office and told them everything. The footprints, the stranger, the break-in attempt. They took me seriously and sent a deputy to check the cabin. When they arrived, they found evidence of someone living there recently: old food wrappers, a makeshift bed outside the cabin, and a hunting rifle hidden behind some logs. The deputy told me this was likely someone who had been squatting in the woods, maybe a criminal hiding from the law. They increased patrols in the area after that. I never went back to the cabin. The police never caught the man, but I always hoped the woods swallowed him up. That weekend changed me. It showed me how close danger can be, even in places that feel safe and quiet. And it taught me that some parts of the forest are better left alone. The reason I never returned was not just fear, but respect for the reality of what I experienced. The cabin, once a peaceful retreat, had become a trap. The forest, with its towering pines and endless shadows, hid more than just wildlife. It hid people with bad intentions. And when you find yourself alone in those woods, every sound and shadow becomes a reminder that not all dangers come from the supernatural. Sometimes the real terror is human, cold and calculated, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I eventually sold the cabin, wanting to erase that dark chapter from my life. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls through the city streets, I still remember that cold night in the woods, the man's silent eyes, and the feeling of being hunted. It's a memory I carry with me, a warning about the wild places and the people who live hidden within them. And that's how a weekend meant for peace became a nightmare I could never forget. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. After the constant grind of work, the noise of the city, and the never-ending bustle of people, I needed a break. My name is Lucas. I'm 34 years old, and I live in Oregon. It was late September 2008 when I decided to rent a small cabin in the Cascade Mountains for a week of solitude. The plan was simple: pack some food, a few books, and just disappear into the woods. The cabin I rented was about 2 hours outside of Eugene, tucked away near a small lake. It wasn't fancy, just a one-room wooden building with a fireplace, a bed, and a small kitchen. There was no cell phone service, no internet. It was the perfect escape. I arrived just before sunset, the fading orange sky casting long shadows across the tall pine trees. The air was crisp and smelled like earth and pine needles. I parked my old truck beside the gravel path leading up to the cabin and unloaded my bags. The place was quiet except for the soft sound of leaves rustling in the wind and distant birds settling down for the night. Inside, the cabin smelled like wood smoke and dust. I opened the windows to let fresh air in and unpacked my things. The bed was old but clean, with thick blankets folded neatly at the foot. The kitchen had a small propane stove and a rusty kettle. I found a stack of firewood piled outside, so I brought some inside and lit the fireplace to warm up the room. The first night was peaceful. I cooked some canned beans on the stove, drank black coffee, and read a book by the fire until I grew too tired and went to bed. The silence outside was complete. I couldn't even hear a car or a plane. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. Over the next few days, I spent most of my time hiking the trails around the lake and exploring the forest. The trees were tall and thick, their branches creating a dense canopy above. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves. I saw squirrels, deer tracks, and once a fox darting across a clearing. During the afternoons, I sat outside the cabin with a notebook, writing down my thoughts and sketches of the landscape. It was exactly the kind of quiet I wanted. On the fourth day, the weather changed. The sky turned gray and heavy clouds rolled in by mid-morning. I was walking a trail about a mile from the cabin when the first drops of rain began to fall. The path became slippery, and the rain thickened quickly, so I turned back toward the cabin. When I arrived, soaked through, the fire was still smoldering in the fireplace. I stripped off my wet clothes, dried myself as best I could, and set to drying my boots by the fire. That night, the rain came down hard, drumming on the metal roof. I listened to the storm while wrapped in a blanket, a little uneasy but mostly comforted by the sound. The forest seemed alive with noise, water flowing, trees creaking, and occasional distant thunder. The next morning, the rain stopped, but everything was damp and chilly. I planned to hike down to the lake to take some pictures. It was early when I grabbed my camera and stepped outside. The forest was wet and smelled like fresh earth. The lake was calm, glassy, with mist rising from its surface. I took several photos of the water and trees, feeling peaceful despite the cold. As I was about to head back, I noticed something unusual near the water's edge. A small path, partly hidden by bushes, led down a slope to a narrow strip of beach. I hadn't seen it before. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to check it out. I followed the path carefully. The ground was soft and muddy. The bushes thickened, and the air smelled damp and a little sour. When I reached the beach, I stopped. There, lying half covered in wet leaves and mud, was a human body. At first, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The body was mostly hidden, but I could make out a face turned to the side, pale and swollen, eyes closed. The clothes were torn and dirty, soaked through. The skin looked cold and stiff. My heart hammered in my chest as the reality settled in. This was a dead person. I stepped back slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The rain from the night before had washed away any footprints except mine. The body was obviously there for some time, maybe days or weeks. I noticed bruises on the arms and dark stains on the shirt that looked like dried blood. The mouth was slightly open, and there was a faint smell, something sour and metallic. Fear began to spread through me like a cold wave. I had never seen a dead body before, and the sight was worse than anything I could have imagined. My mind raced. I thought about calling the police, but I had no signal at the cabin, and the nearest town was miles away. I tried my phone anyway, nothing. No bars, no way to reach anyone. I sat down on a nearby rock, trying to steady myself. My hands trembled as I took out my jacket to cover the body, hoping to protect it from birds or animals until I could get help. I forced myself to calm down and think. Panic wouldn't help. The first thing I needed to do was get back to the cabin. I carefully retraced my steps, avoiding the muddy path, and kept an eye on the surroundings. The forest seemed darker now, even though it was still morning. The clouds were thick and low. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and sat by the window, staring out at the trees. The image of the dead body was burned into my mind. I thought about who this person could be. A missing hiker? A victim of foul play? Or maybe someone who died from exposure and no one had found them. I knew I had to report it, but without signal, I was trapped. I tried to remain calm and thought about walking to the nearest ranger station, which I knew was about 5 miles away down the main road. It wasn't an easy trek, but I felt I had no choice. I packed a small bag with water, a flashlight, and my phone, even though it was useless here, and started out. The rain had stopped, but the forest floor was slippery. The trees loomed overhead, casting strange shadows. I kept looking behind me, half expecting to see someone following, but there was only silence. The walk took longer than I expected. The forest grew denser, the trail narrower and less clear. After nearly 2 hours, I reached the edge of the woods and saw the gravel road. Relief flooded me. I started walking toward the ranger station. It was a small wooden building with a porch and a single lamp flickering. I knocked on the door, hoping someone was inside. After a moment, an older man answered. He looked tired but alert. I quickly told him about the body by the lake. He listened carefully, then said he would call the sheriff. He handed me a warm cup of coffee and asked if I was all right. I nodded, though I still felt shaken. The man told me to wait inside while he made the call. About 30 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived, followed by 2 officers. We went back to the cabin together and then to the lake. They carefully examined the area, took photographs, and marked the spot where the body lay. They thanked me for reporting it and said they would investigate immediately. Over the next few hours, they questioned me about everything. When I arrived, what I had seen, and if I noticed anyone suspicious. I told them the truth. I was alone, no one else around. They seemed to believe me but looked serious. The body was taken away for autopsy. The sheriff deputy drove me back to my cabin to gather my things. I told them I wanted to leave, but the road back to Eugene was closed for repairs, so I stayed the night with the rangers in the station. The next day, I left the woods with a heavy heart. The experience stayed with me. The silence of the forest, the sudden shock of finding death so close, the helplessness of being isolated. It was a reminder that the wild is not always peaceful or safe. People can disappear, sometimes without a trace, and the truth is often harder to face than any ghost story. Weeks later, I read in the local paper that the body was identified as a missing man from a nearby town. He had been reported missing for over a month. The cause of death was exposure combined with an old injury. There was no sign of foul play, just a tragic accident. I never returned to that cabin again, but the memory of that rainy morning by the lake stayed with me. A sharp, clear moment when the quiet of the woods was broken by the cold reality of death. The moment I saw the cabin from the road, I knew this trip would be different. I'd been looking forward to this week off for months, craving the kind of silence and isolation you can only find deep in the forest. No phone signal, no internet, no city noise, just trees, birds, and the steady crackle of the fireplace. I was tired of the constant noise of Minneapolis and the relentless pressure of work. I wanted to disappear for a while. I had chosen a small cabin near Lake Vermilion, a remote area where people came to fish and hunt, but few lived year-round. The place was an old, weathered structure, built mostly of rough pine logs. It sat tucked between a handful of ancient pines, their branches thick and tangled. The roof sagged a little, and the paint was peeling from the window frames. The porch was cluttered with an old rocking chair and some rusted tools. The place smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and something faintly sour. Moss, maybe, or the rotting leaves piled in the corners. My car rattled as I pulled it off the gravel road onto a narrow, overgrown track that led right up to the cabin. The sun was dropping low, casting long shadows between the trees. The forest floor was littered with pine needles and cracked cones. I grabbed my bags, including a cooler with food, a small gas stove, and enough firewood stacked beside the porch to last the week. The air was cool but not cold, the kind of early autumn chill that made your breath visible in quick puffs. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. The main room had a wood stove, a rickety table with 2 chairs, and a fold-out couch. The kitchen was tiny, just a sink and a narrow counter, with a couple of shelves holding dusty cans and boxes. There was a small bedroom off to the side with a bed and a thin blanket, and a bathroom with a cold water tap but no shower. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to get settled. Lighting the stove was easier than I expected, and soon the cabin filled with the comforting smell of burning pine. I opened a window to let in the fresh air, though I closed the door firmly behind me. Outside, the woods were growing darker, the last slivers of sun sinking behind the hills. That first night, I lay awake for a while, listening to the forest. The wind whispered through the pines, and far off, an owl called softly. Somewhere nearby, a deer shuffled through the underbrush. The quiet felt heavy and thick, almost like the woods themselves were watching me. The next day, I woke early, the smell of damp leaves drifting in through the cracked window. I made coffee on the stove, poured it into a chipped mug, and sat on the porch, watching the mist roll off the lake. The water was calm and mirror-flat, reflecting the pale blue sky and the treetops. A single loon cried out, sharp and lonely. I spent the day exploring the trails around the cabin, following paths worn by hikers and hunters. The forest was dense, the trees towering and close, with tangled roots and moss-covered stones. Sometimes I spotted small animals, squirrels darting up trees, a fox slipping silently through the undergrowth. The smell of pine and damp earth filled the air, mixed with the faint sweetness of wild berries and the sharp tang of crushed leaves underfoot. I felt a strange sense of peace in the solitude, but also a growing awareness of how far away I was from anything familiar. My phone had no signal at all, and the only sounds were natural ones, except for the occasional distant hum of a passing truck on the main road. I felt free but also small and exposed. Back at the cabin, I cooked a simple dinner on the stove. A tin of chili warmed over the flame. I ate quietly, the silence pressing in around me. As night fell, I gathered firewood from the stack and fed the stove until the cabin glowed orange and warm. Outside, the forest had fallen completely silent. Even the owls seemed to have stopped. That night, I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the day's walk. On the third day, things started to feel different. It began with small things, unusual noises outside the cabin after dark, like the snap of a branch or the rustle of leaves. At first, I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. I reminded myself I was in the woods, and wild animals lived here. But then, I found something strange. The door to the cabin, which I had locked tightly the night before, was slightly ajar when I went outside in the morning. The lock wasn't broken, and nothing seemed stolen, but I was sure I had locked it. I checked the windows. They were closed and intact. The firewood stack was still there, nothing disturbed. My bags and supplies inside the cabin hadn't been touched. The feeling of unease grew, but I told myself I must have forgotten to lock the door properly. Later that day, while walking a trail near a small creek, I spotted footprints in the soft mud. They were large and heavy with deep impressions. Nothing about them looked like animal tracks. They were human. I traced them back toward the cabin. For the first time, the isolation felt threatening. I didn't tell anyone, of course. There was no signal, no way to call out. The cabin was too remote. I felt a tightening in my chest, a cold nervousness creeping into my bones. That evening, I double-checked all the doors and windows, barricading the door with a heavy chair just in case. I sat by the stove, a loaded hunting rifle resting across my lap, feeling foolish but also oddly reassured. On the fourth night, the noises started again, louder and closer. At first, just distant snapping branches and the faint crunch of leaves. Then, around midnight, I heard heavy breathing outside the cabin, just beyond the porch. I froze, heart pounding. The breath came again, slow, deliberate, like someone waiting. I grabbed the rifle and slowly moved toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Outside, the shadows shifted among the trees. I saw nothing at first. Then, a figure stepped into the pale moonlight. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and jeans, his face mostly hidden by a hood. He stood just beyond the edge of the porch, watching. I didn't move or breathe. I tried to stay calm. The man didn't speak or make any move. He just stood there for a long moment. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he slipped back into the trees. I spent the rest of the night awake, watching every shadow, waiting for dawn. In the morning, I found fresh footprints around the cabin. Not just one person, but several. They circled the cabin slowly, like they were searching for something. My blood ran cold. This wasn't random anymore. I packed my gear quickly, but as I loaded the last bag into my car, I heard a noise behind me. A twig snapping, quick and sharp. I spun around, rifle raised. No one. I got into the car and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove down the gravel track, I looked in the rearview mirror. The trees blurred past, but I thought I saw movement. figures slipping between the trunks. Watching. I never returned to that cabin again.